we're just a few days away from free agency, and the NBA already has a big trade to announce. Atlanta Hawks guard Dejounte Murray is headed to the New Orleans Pelicans for Larry Nance Jr., Dyson Daniels, 2025 Lakers unprotected first round pick, and a 2027 Milwaukee Bucks pick. Obviously, Dejounte Murray was in trade rumors earlier in the season at the trade deadline. There were a couple of teams that, were rumored to be after him, one including the Lakers, also the New Orleans Pelicans, right, which we covered on, our trade deadline live stream actually way back in February. So, what are your thoughts on this trade? Because this one kind of came out of nowhere. Obviously, there were reports that the Atlanta Hawks would, explore Murray trades after the deadline in the offseason. But, just kind of at face value, it just, obviously for New Orleans, you got back, a star player without really having to give up a lot in terms of players. Obviously, you gave up future picks, but they're not even their own. And, this would also signal that Atlanta's probably headed towards, a very significant rebuild, including, other players on the way.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think I'm giving this trade the green light. I think this is good for both sides. I think this was something that was a necessity to happen for Atlanta because, like we had talked about, very dysfunctional backcourt and definitely a very dysfunctional time, I think, in tenure for both of those guys, and Trey Young and Dejounte Murray being played together at the same time. It just wasn't working. You could see it, and it definitely shows in their results in the seasons that they played together. So, number one, like I said, it definitely. It signifies like the Atlanta Hawks are going to be doing their rebuild very soon, like you just said. Yeah. And Reese Asher, him coming in as well, that kind of also kickstarts it as well. So I think it's a good thing for Atlanta because you do need to get the ball rolling on this thing, because if you held on to one of those guys, I think a little bit too long, it probably wouldn't have worked out in your favor. And I think they made the right decision moving Dejounte Murray over Trey Young. I would prefer to have Trey Young as my starting point guard than Dejounte Murray. That's no knock on Dejounte Murray. I just think Trey Young brings a lot more on the offensive end. And obviously Dejounte Murray has his pluses and minuses. Clearly that's why he was traded in the first place, because, and that's kind of what New Orleans needs from a fit perspective. If you really think about it, it's like, okay, yeah, now we've got a real point guard, who has, a little bit of two-way tendencies, can, work the mid-range, has, we've seen him hit the three ball at an efficient rate as well, and he can get downhill a little bit too. So I think he kind of fits better than like maybe a CJ McCollum, so expect him to maybe be on the move. And as well as like, Ingram, that's another thing. Like that's a whole different storyline. Ingram has been being monitored by multiple teams as well. So expect, the Pelicans to also look a little bit different, but obviously these two teams are in different, I guess, areas of their, or different eras, in terms of what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish, where, the Pelicans are trying to contend. And I think this is a contender kind of move versus the Hawks, where this is for sure the kickstart of a rebuild.
Yeah, New Orleans is in win now mode compared to Atlanta, who's in a rebuild. Like you said, I do wonder what New Orleans does with the rest of the roster, right? Because now you got, an interesting, I don't want to say crowded, but you have an interesting mix of players where you have Dejounte Murray to add to, the starting five or the starting guards that was CJ McCollum and Herb Jones. So what does that mean for, say like a CJ McCollum? Does he stay there? Does he end up getting moved, right? Because you could make the case that those two guys maybe fit together better than Trey Young and Dejounte Murray, right? Just because McCollum can be, more effective off the ball than, say, a Trey Young. But then also, like you said, does that mean you move Herb Jones to the bench? Or does it mean that, even like a Brandon Ingram, as you mentioned, could he be on the move? Also, considering they gave up Larry Nance Jr., right, and Dyson Daniels, now what do you do with your center depth? Because, we know Valanciunas probably isn't coming back unless they re-sign him. And then Larry Nance Jr. is gone. So, obviously they drafted Yves Missi in the draft, but, you're probably going to have to do a little bit better than that in order to get, a center, unless you're running Zion at center.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it could work, though, because from what I've seen from Yves Missi, he's super duper athletic and he's got the motor to kind of fit with them. Just can't really shoot or space the floor. So, I think they do have other questions and other moves, and I think that will kind of be addressed with, probably Ingram's departure. That's what I'm kind of looking at them to kind of do, is return or get returns that make sense, where it's like maybe not a wing for a wing, but maybe a wing for a big or something like that. And of the teams that, have been mentioned, I think there is a possibility for that.
Yeah, for Dejounte Murray, 22.5 points a game, 5 rebounds, 6.5 assists, right? Shot, pretty much 36% from three last season, right? So obviously, that wasn't normally a part of his game historically, but it has improved. Defensively isn't quite what he used to be, but you would hope for a team like New Orleans that also has other, talented defensive players that he should be able to tap into that, which is, the case that we made, when he was up for, being moved at the deadline, is the fact that defensively he should be more impactful than Trey Young. But now we look at it from a Hawks perspective, what comes next for them? Because it sounded like, according to Woj and Shams, that Atlanta is going to do some other stuff with the roster as well, right? So it could be possible that Trey Young could be gone as well, or DeAndre Hunter, or Clint Capella, or anybody on the roster, basically. It's pretty much kind of been put out there that the only real untouchables is essentially Jalen Johnson and Reese Asher, who they just drafted #1. So, if you're the Hawks, which is the next, move that you kind of take care of? Would you say Trey Young, or would you say maybe one of the smaller ones first?
I'm swinging big. I think I'm getting rid of Trey Young first. If you want me to be honest, I think there is a opportunity for that, and I think we already know he has multiple suitors. Considering the first round picks that were moved, around and before the draft. So I think there is potential for him to be moved, but I would understand, maybe getting rid of like a DeAndre Hunter, to kind of get back some other assets that you could potentially flip later down the line. But yeah, I'm looking at Trey Young because I think there's going to be a serious market for him now, if he is, made readily available, like the reports are suggesting, because I think, he could garner a pretty good package in terms of what you would get in return for him, because I think he's one of those guys that's maybe like, he brings so much to the table offensively. It's just the defense has always been a question and will continue to be a question, and probably a non-factor if you want me to be honest. But, I think executives will probably value him very high just because of his ability, to set people up for success. Because look at the guys that he was playing with before, and you look at when the Hawks were good, he made a lot of those guys look like some serious, ball players. Whereas, now they're in different situations and they're not doing too hot. So I think, Trey Young has that ability to make people around him play a lot better, as long as he's the focal point of the offense. Or it's, maybe a point guard big man duo or a point guard wing duo versus, a guard, like, a backcourt duo. I just don't think that's smart, so I think people will have learned their lesson. I'm not expecting teams that have like a guard to kind of target him. I'm expecting teams that, have a big and no serious point guard. So that's what I'm kind of expecting.
Yeah, as we talked about in previous videos, he's an offensive engine unto himself. There's been rumors that Murray could be valued more by teams than Trey Young, so I do wonder if he gets traded, what does that trade return look like? Is it more so just, you're going to have to match about 40 million in terms of salary, right? But, are there teams that have 40 million just to kind of give away? I'm not sure, right? It kind of depends. As for, a couple other teams, right, that were chasing after him, right? Because there were other teams that were rumored, maybe at the deadline, right? Knicks was one, right? Obviously, they got Mikal Bridges, so you don't really have to think about that. Warriors was one, which is intriguing, but they obviously have their own stuff that they might be figuring out, right, with the Chris Paul delayed option for his fully guaranteed deal, right? But another team, right, the Lakers, right? So, like, what's the next pivot for them as well, right? Because obviously that was a target that, a lot of people thought could go there, and now you can't get him, right? And obviously we remember at the time, right, it sounded like Atlanta wanted Austin Reeves, but the Lakers were not interested in giving him up in the deal. So where do you go from here if you're the Lakers? Especially, considering that now, one of your possible potential rivals in the West just added a guy that you were trying to get for basically less.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the Lakers have a multitude of questions. Number one, I would address the big man situation. I think that big man room is very, very thin. I think it's very questionable in terms of, how good it is compared to the contenders that are in the West and who you're going to have to compete with if you even get to the playoffs next year. So that would be kind of my number one thing. And, I don't even know who would be available to pivot to. That's the question, because even if you look at the free agent market, it's not the greatest. Everybody knows that. So I don't know what you kind of look for, because at the very least, you're kind of looking for a backup big. So not necessarily, a starting caliber one, potentially. I don't know. It all depends on what Redick and what the Lakers decide to do. Maybe they put AD at the 4, maybe they put him at the 5, depending on who, comes in. But I'm going to assume that he's going to play the 5 and Braun will play the 4. But regardless, I don't know, because I feel like this was kind of like their luck in the chamber shot, where it's like, we kind of thought that they were going to get Dejounte Murray. It's just a matter of what the package was going to look like and somebody was going to bend or fold. But it is interesting to see what Dejounte Murray did go for compared to what was reportedly offered with the Lakers.
Yeah.
Because I don't know who they go to. I don't know where you go from there.
Right.
Because what do you think as a Laker fan, though?
Yeah, I mean, the next move, I'm not really sure, right? Because obviously we talked about it with the Trey Young thing where it's like, I don't know if we're really sure if that really makes a whole lot of sense, right? Because he's a lot more expensive and there's a lot more defensive concerns, even though he would probably be the better player. But, first you have to figure out what happens with D'Lo, right? Because obviously he has a contract option that's coming up right on Friday. He basically has to determine whether or not he opts in or out. And that's probably going to kind of allow them to figure out where to pivot to. Because if he opts in, then it makes it easier to decide to probably trade him. But if he opts out, then you either risk losing him for nothing, or you have to re-sign him and bring him back, and then you can't trade him until the deadline again, and then you have to basically go through what you just went through last season. So, there's a lot of stuff that they kind of have to figure out. But, the big story here obviously is DeJounte Murray going to New Orleans, and that's a good get for them, right? Obviously, and even Woj mentioned the fact that New Orleans was not a very good team late in games. And DeJounte Murray was pretty good late in games last year, right? He's got a big highlight reel of game winners and big time shots. So that's a guy that you can go to, who can get shots from pretty much anywhere on the floor, especially in the mid range and, in the restricted areas with floaters and whatnot. I know he's not like a strong finisher at the rim, but he's a skill finisher. So New Orleans got a good one. And I'm very curious to see where both New Orleans and Atlanta go from here.